Throughout human history, in fact, almost every, what am I or who am I and why have been created? But clearly, very few people stay with these inquiries or come to some realization, and naturally, these people are quite rightly considered very unusual. So it's quite common practice in different cultures, either to say, oh, this man must be half God, half man, or he must be incarnation of God, or he must be the special son of God, or some expression like this. Because it is extremely unusual for people to actually come to a real understanding behind this. And it is not confined to one religion or one culture. Everywhere human beings ask this kind of question. As I just said, they don't usually stay with it. And just to remind you, the oldest text in the Indo-European language, the Rig Veda, for example, has this very question. Since at least 3 or 4 of you have participated in all my talks, you will realize today that I'm basically trying to give an overall summary of the whole thing. So some of these things I'm sure you have heard earlier. Na vijanami yadi vedamasmi ninya sanadha manasa charami. I do not know what I am, yet burdened by my mind. Sometimes it is actually translated as, yet arrogant in my mind. I wonder what I am. So, similarly, some of you would maybe more familiar with one of the Psalms. This is Psalm 8. When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the sun and the moon that thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Whenever one looks at something especially large and is even temporarily aware of the fact that whatever in my case is called Ravi is here only temporarily, that reminder is inevitably raises to this kind of question. Why I have been created, what I am, what are the forces running the universe and therefore also creating me? This is nothing new. In a way, these questions are absolutely fundamental, and of course always the reminder actually again and again in all, as far as I am aware, in all Christian monasteries or Buddhist monasteries, every monastery, especially monasteries, the monks, whenever they will meet each other, they would remind them, brother, remember death. Simply because that is the one thing that can then more likely to invite us to wonder, why am I here for a few decades? And I occasionally try to remind my friends who practice yoga, generally in the yoga practice, the very last asana or posture that they take is shavasana, which literally means corpse pose. But they probably just think it's a nice way to relax, which is fine. It is a good idea to relax. One really relaxes in death. But one also needs to understand that all of these postures have psychological effect. They have effect on one's breathing. And really the call that, if one can understand it, that all the tensions in our body or in our mind are self-assertions. And therefore the call in the corpse pose, at least temporarily, to see if I can be deeply relaxed, can I be temporarily without asserting myself and allow some real energy to actually touch me. So maybe next time you people practice Shavasana, all yoga people actually do this at the very end of their practice. Therefore, this, of course, this reminder, usually for most people, quite rightly really, creates a kind of fear. So this inquiry begins from, oh my goodness, what will happen? especially those people who have a considerable amount of money or property or this or that. What will happen to it then? But the search by any of the real searchers has been really out of a sense of wonder, not out of fear. Because there is a general understanding in all spiritual teachings that the death of the body is not the death of the person. Always an invitation that the person is something other than the body, and how to relate with this. This is, in fact, I had to say, what is the one common thing in all religions or spiritual practices at every level, from the lowest level of understanding to the highest level, this will be the one common feature of all of them. Every religion would say this. And therefore, it's good at least not to dismiss this remark. And what does it do? It naturally then calls us to say, am I essentially just this body that will obviously die? If there is one fact that we can all agree to, that is the one fact that no human being can deny, that this body will actually die. And then another remark that I had made earlier, just to not everybody was there right from the very beginning. We have a very strong, it's a linguistic habit. I am breathing. Did I create this breathing apparatus? Even our fanciest doctors, after hundreds of years of research, are not wholly able to say, how does this breathing actually take place? I can't even create my nails, not to speak about the breathing apparatus, and then the air that we need to breathe. Did I create that? If one takes any of these simple, obvious observations seriously, I mean, this is hardly anything fancy I am saying, then one wonders, what is keeping this body alive? Yesterday in a conversation with some friends, I had mentioned the name of a Nobel Prize winner, George Wald. I had this exchange with him a long time ago, 1977, actually. He had just won a Nobel Prize for figuring out the whole structure of vision, everything in the eyes to do. But what was striking him, and this is what brought our conversation together, that he said, you know, we can create the whole structure of the eye, but it doesn't see. As if something else is seeing through that structure. And of course, if the structure is not working properly, then it doesn't see properly. So what they are doing, or what any medical person is doing, is to somehow fix the structure so that one can see through it directly. But you can have a completely functioning structure, but it doesn't see. So for him, this was he was of Jewish origin. Until that time, he was rejecting the whole Jewish background, as is standard practice in every religion. But after this, he became very interested in the Jewish tradition. I mention this because suddenly he realized that we know the whole damn structure, but it doesn't see. What is it that sees? And then, of course, varieties of expressions can be used. Well, it's consciousness, it's coming from the spirit, or this or that. But this is the kind of concern that the spiritual teachings have been occupied with. This is what completely turned him back to the Jewish tradition. I was very struck by this whole exchange. So, at present, of course, it is not possible for the medical people to create the whole body, which will still remain in some senses functioning. But even if they could create it, the structure, will it actually be alive in the sense that it will see something, will be able to do something? It will be like seeing through the structure of the eyes. Therefore, again and again a reminder that it is not that I am breathing, but I am being breathed. And sometimes it gets more explicitly so stated, just to remind you, in the book of Genesis, since my friend is going to check it, it's the 2nd chapter, 7th verse. You see, he's always checking. This is what it says. Now, I'm putting it in my words, but it also, everybody here realizes that every translation of the Bible is slightly different from the other translation. So don't get so occupied with one particular translation. For example, the Catholic translations are different from the Protestant translations, which may surprise you, but or just a reminder of something maybe more significant. St. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, is periodically speaking about love. But the translation that was done at the time of King James, the word that is used for love is charity. Faith, hope, and charity, not faith, hope, and love. Now, for contemporary users, this charity doesn't carry the same feeling behind it. So I'm simply reminding you the language itself is rather significant, to be clear about this. But in any case, this is what this particular verse in the Genesis actually says, that God created human beings from the earth, then he breathed his own breath into them to make them alive. Certainly in my case, I'm not sure that I really understand all this, but nothing in me wishes to dismiss it. It invites me to question something, to search for something, and I begin to see it creates a very different feeling in me if I stay with this, that as long as I am alive, it's the breath of God that is keeping me alive. That is what is breathing me, not that I am breathing. And the moment this breath leaves, whatever is called Ravi will expire. So, just simple reminders of the expressions. More to spiritual search, repeatedly I have said this in slightly different forms. Feeling or heart is the first avenue to truth. Spiritual search, unless it touches one's feeling, even though one can honestly say that I don't really understand this, by which one means intellectually I'm not sure I can really clarify this or understand this or explain this. But if it touches one's feeling, already then one is in touch with something slightly more subtle, more real. But if it doesn't touch your heart in any way, then obviously you're not going to pursue this. So let me again and again remind you, very strong suggestion that this question or these related questions, these two are intimately related. Who am I? Or I tend to actually call what am I? Because even to say who am I already personifies one in a way. But it doesn't matter what expression you use. And why am I here? These are very intimately connected with each other. And I think I had probably mentioned this in passing. One very great Zen master actually said to me on one occasion that every Zen koan at its root has this question: who am I? Although often it is expressed obviously quite differently. Therefore, periodically to return to these questions, even merely intellectually to begin with, can sometimes bring a feeling that can then relate us with something subtler. That's my strong suggestion. Then I had been trying to speak here about truth or God is not Hindu or Christian, but we all are, whether we like it or not. Each one of us is very deeply conditioned by our cultural background. Even those people who might say, I'm an agnostic, I hate God, all that is fine, but they're still conditioned by their culture. Even the languages are very much influenced. I have more than once mentioned here, great scholar Northrop Frye had written a book called The Great Code, in which he discusses how the Bible has influences all the European languages. Simple example, the very word Bible in Greek simply means the book. But now, so if I said, well, here is the Bible, does that make sense? Because we now understand differently what the word Bible means. Everything in the whole European culture has been very much influenced by not only the Bible, but the whole Judeo-Christian background relation to this. And therefore, more and more they call that in a global culture. I was actually a little surprised only a few days back. Somebody was telling me this, that now the general impression is that in the next 50 years, more than half the people on the planet will be of mixed races. We have some more standard biologists here. Whether this is true, I don't know, but this is one of the. If that is actually true, that makes the culture more and more global, even. Already your president here says the Indians are taking over. So you have to be a little bit aware of what the Indians believe or think about or whatever, you know. So even from that perspective, even in order to defend yourself, you need to know what the other cultures are emphasizing. So in the global culture, how do we make room for different perspectives? And again, another thing which is more or less at the basis of this question that I'm now raising, every great teacher has said in one form or the other that what they are experiencing or what they are calling us to experience cannot really be described. And therefore, not to imagine that just because we get some expression from somebody else, as if that's going to describe it, but to have more than one expression trying to describe something, it has several consequences. One is something that I have again said several times, then one becomes aware that expression of truth is not the truth. That at the very best, an expression is pointing to something, but truth requires actually letting it inhabit me, to actually be practicing this, relating with this. But secondly, having different expressions not only can free one from getting attached to one particular society or particular church or organization, which is just emphasizing only that expression, because again, I have used these metaphors several times. At the very best, every teaching or every religion is like a finger pointing to the moon. If you get so stuck to the finger, you'll never get to the moon. Every great teacher, I give you examples from the Buddha and Christ, just so who could deny that these are great teachers? Christ was accused of destroying the tradition. What did he say? I haven't come to destroy the tradition, but to fulfill it. Similarly, the Buddha was accused later on by Shankara, particularly, that he's destroying the whole Rig Vedic background of the tradition. And the purpose of the tradition, if one looks at it seriously, is to assist a searcher to transcend the tradition. Because tradition of necessity has to be expressed in some language, it has to be expressed in some kind of art, some kind of music, but those are expressions. And if the tradition actually succeeds, it can assist a searcher to go beyond the expressions, to come to the truth. So in fact, the very heart of any serious tradition is that a searcher would transcend that tradition. It may seem strange, but this is, one has to realize, what is the purpose of a finger pointing to the moon? Not sticking to the finger. If somebody is a serious searcher, then they can in fact see how they might actually get to the moon. So I'm repeating this remark because people are always surprised by my saying this, that the purpose of the tradition in fact really is to assist a searcher to transcend the tradition, which then would be called by Christ's remark as if he's therefore fulfilling the tradition, fulfilling in that context, meaning he's actually in fact carrying out what the tradition is at best meant to do. And then one of the fundamental understanding in all spiritual teachings, there are several common features. I think I spoke about several of them. I will quickly mention a few. One is that the whole manifested universe comes from the highest level of consciousness. Naturally, the words vary from culture to culture. Comes from God or from the Absolute or from Brahma or from that. Just simply always saying that it really can't be described, but one can see how one can get so attached to some expression. You may be surprised now, in some Muslim-oriented countries, God cannot be translated as Allah, because they say Allah is not what people mean by God. Has to be a unique word for itself. Now, you see how one can get that, how the language itself can become occupied by something or the other. And so, this is the reason I'm saying don't get so attached to what particular word may be used for it, but what are some of its characteristics? One is to do with that it has highest level of consciousness. Sometimes in the English language, some other words get used rather than consciousness. For example, awareness or attention. They do have slightly different meanings, but sometimes they get interchangeably used. That's the reason I'm mentioning this here. And then that in different traditions, slightly different aspects get emphasized. But for example, in India, the emphasis is that, first of all, it is vastness, but standard Sanskrit expressions are Sat, Chit, Anand, meaning truth, consciousness, and joy. Somehow the word joy, I don't know why the Christians are so sad about this. They never seem to use this. One of the very great Indian sage contemporary in the 20th century, Sri Aurobindo, actually makes this remark that delight created the universe for delight. Because to say joy or delight or happiness, again, as I said, many different translations of this word. It is not similarly, before I make the other remark, for example, first letter of John in the Bible says God is love. Twice. Fourth chapter. For his sake, I have to say this. But to say God is delight or love or beauty is another expression, especially emphasized in the Buddhist tradition, is not to say that God is loving or creates happiness. That may follow from it. But what is being said is that that is the very structure of whatever we mean by God. It's not a characteristic of God, but the structure of God, the very content of whatever we mean by the word God. Similarly, consciousness. And then several other words are used. For example, omniscient, omnipresent. I occasionally try to remind them we should also use omniamorosus. That's what it means, all loving. But I have rarely heard anybody actually use this expression. I had to, in fact, ask a Latin professor to tell me what will be the right way of saying this. So there are different ways the highest reality gets described, but what is implied by all traditions, that the whole manifested universe has been created by this highest level of reality. And then later on, maybe in just a few minutes, I'll speak about some very major difference between the two major traditions I'm speaking about, the Abrahamic tradition and the Indian tradition. But this is one common feature. And then there are several other common features. First of all, what is the purpose of us being created? According to underlying idea in these traditions is that each level of the manifested universe, therefore each level of human beings, actually strictly speaking, even at the level of the animals, that is more emphasized in the Indian tradition than in the Abrahamic tradition. But certainly at the level of the human beings, the call is for us to assist this particle of divinity which has taken on my body, so that my body and mind can assist the evolution of this particle of divinity to come to a higher and higher level. Ultimately to come back home, come back to the source, come back to God. That's the general call. And therefore the implication obviously is that it's the particle of the divinity, or let's temporarily call it soul. It's the soul that has taken on the body, not that the body has somehow taken on the soul. One needs to be clear about this, that it is the particle of divinity that is creating this body, which is keeping this alive. You could call it the breath of God. Krishna calls it actually a particle of myself, etc. So different expressions are used, not to get stuck on one expression or the other, but the call really is that this is something coming from on high, but in order to evolve more, it needs a body to undertake some appropriate actions. Therefore, it takes on the body. You're surprised by this?
No, I'm just saying it's so hard.
So hard. That is true. In fact, it is even sometimes emphasized that even the reason why the sages have come, or even particularly in the Christian tradition, because Christ is said to be the only Son of God, etc. This is Saint Athanasius from the 3rd century, highly regarded saint. This is his remark. God created man so that man may become God. Call is really to go back to the source. But obviously, extremely few people in human history can manage or have managed to come to that level. But that still doesn't mean that that is not the goal. As I repeatedly maybe have given many other examples, not every functioning scientist is at teaches them. In fact, this is very important thing to realize. It's actually a remark largely coming from my own teacher, John the Salesman, that to assist the quality of consciousness on the planet, it's a little bit like creating a pyramid. Not every stone of the pyramid can be at the top of the stone. But the top stone cannot stay there low. So even a great sage like the Buddha or Christ, or in contemporary, if you look at Raman or Aurobindo or anybody who you regard as a sage, they also require supporting people. In fact, I was quite surprised to hear my own teacher say to me that if some of you people don't work, I myself have difficulty staying at this level. As if the top stone of the pyramid needs to be supported by others closer to it. But it is a tendency, worldly. This is not realizing that every level can actually assist if one is in fact connecting with the pyramid of consciousness rather than interfering with it by connected with other kinds of pyramids. Yeah. And then, as I have said again, times, such as that in general human beings don't live the way they should, and furthermore the way they could. The reason, for example, to say that human beings don't live the way they should could be okay, but if it is not at all possible to live that way, that would not carry the same impact. So the sages actually demonstrate how one can actually live. So it is therefore always to say that it is in fact possible for people to live that way. So it's not only the way they should, but the way they could. And sages demonstrate how this could be. If, for example, the Buddha was not emanating compassion, or Christ was not emanating love, they are not then demonstrating what they are calling us to do. And then we can say, well, it's a good idea to love my enemy, but who the hell can do that? You see what I'm saying? I mean, so the sages actually demonstrate what they are calling us to undertake. And therefore, and this is expressed in varieties of ways. For example, in the Buddhist tradition, one would say one is living as if one is asleep, but one could wake up. Literally, that's what the word Buddha means, one who is awake. Or in the Vedantic tradition, oh, you're living in illusion or in Maya, but you could live in reality. Or maybe in the Christian tradition, one would say you live in sin, but you could live in the grace of God. Or in the Gurdjieffian language, you live mechanically, but you could live more consciously. So you see, there are varieties of ways of conveying this notion, but always if these sages who say these things don't in fact demonstrate that in their life, then sooner or later people dismiss them. Because otherwise it's all very nice to say you should love your enemy, but if Christ himself could not possibly do that, what's the point of following him? So, as I just said, there are many common features, and I'm just quickly mentioning a few, but now wishing to speak about one very fundamental difference in the two major traditions that I've spoken about. The fundamental difference really is that in India, there is not a creation myth. Strictly speaking, I have personally never heard anybody call it emanation myth, but that's what I call, and nobody objects to it, so it may be right to do it. There is an emanation myth, because the scholars are almost determined to object to anything one says or does. But so far, nobody has objected to this. Basically, what it means that first of all, the label in the Indian tradition for the highest or the subtlest reality. By the way, this expression like highest is largely coming from the Judeo-Christian tradition, because there is always a bit of a tendency to think as if God is above us. In the Indian tradition, one is more likely to say deepest. But in any case, the subtlest level of reality, Brahma is the name for this, which literally simply means the vastness. That's the literal Sanskrit word. And I think I had mentioned the other day that contemporary English word vastness seems to convey the notion of large space, but not the notion of large time. So some people, for example, Annie Besant, translates this as the eternal, trying to convey something to do with time also. But it literally just simply means the vastness in time as well as in space and everything else. So Brahma did not create the world, but the whole manifested universe has emanated from, I was just going to say, his substance. That's is expressed in the Sanskrit language as neuter, because it is not developed enough to be gender, but because it is not yet degenerated enough to be stuck with one gender. It is beyond gender. Brahma did not create the world, but the whole manifested universe emanated from its substance. And the classical example of this in the oldest Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, just as the spider web comes from the substance of the spider, and then the spider can move anywhere on the web or even away from the web. So Brahma is not stuck in the manifested universe or at any one particular place, but it can be in the universe. In fact, everything in the universe has a particle of Brahma in it, otherwise it can't exist. And this is very much emphasized again by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, where he actually explicitly says that everything that exists is a combination of what he calls the field, by which he means that field. And then he says, I am the knower of field in all fields. Everything that exists has a particle of Krishna in it, or particle of Brahma in it. Really is the fundamental difference in the two cultures, and therefore, almost immediately, the call for a spiritual searcher in the Indian tradition is to find that aspect in me, in each one of us, which is identically the same as Brahma. And therefore, whenever a person is actually able truly to say, I am Brahma, or if I translated this into English, let us say, I am God, he's not going to be crucified as Christ was, or Al-Halaj, or anybody else who came anywhere close to this in the Abrahamic tradition was always in trouble. But in the Indian tradition, that doesn't mean that anybody can just say it. Even a scoundrel like me could say that, but that doesn't make it true. Question really is, if a person says it and anybody around him or her is able to have some sense that it comes from real truth, they are celebrated rather than condemned or crucified. And this creates a very large difference between the two cultures. And because there the call again and again in the whole of the Indian tradition is to in fact try what will in fact assist you to realize your oneness with Brahma. So your deepest self is identically the same as Brahma. This is called the supreme identity in the Indian tradition. And there are 4, in Sanskrit they are called Mahavakyas, which will literally mean great enunciations. And first one is, I am Brahma. Second one is, you are that. Third one is, your deepest self, which is called Atma, is identically the same as Brahma. And the fourth one is, consciousness, or the word is pragya. It's sometimes translated as wisdom, sometimes as consciousness, sometimes as integrated intelligence, So it depends on who's doing. It's partly the difficulty of the language, and after all, they were not speaking in English, so they're using a different word. But now we are trying to translate this into English. So we could use the word consciousness. That consciousness is Brahma. These are the four great enunciations in the Upanishads. And this kind of notion is emphasized sometimes in slightly different ways or different language. For example, the remark of the Buddha, look within, you are the Buddha. Trying to convey the same thing, but slightly different. And in slightly more contemporary times, 20th century, by the way, in India, 1,000-year gap is just said to be contemporary. Just yesterday. Tendency in India. Raman, who we call Maharishi, which is a way of saying great sage, by the way. This is not his name. His name is Raman, but he's usually called Raman Maharishi, which is him as a great sage. And somebody asked him, that quality of perception to come already indicates that he's connected with something more real. Why would he be labeled Maharishi? So, in my judgment, this is really the fundamental difference between the two major traditions or categories of tradition that I've been speaking about. And many things follow from it. One is, maybe the most significant thing that follows from it, is from the Indian perspective, the standard or the main feature is one, everything is Brahma. Krishna even specifically says this, if you're interested, 7th chapter, 19th verse. That at the end of many births, maybe I say this in Sanskrit, Bahunam janmanam ante jnanavan mama prapadyate vasudeva sarvamiti. Of many births, a wise person comes to me realizing that all there is Krishna. Such a person is a great soul, but very rare. Very rare. Krishna himself is acknowledging that. So does Christ, actually. He says, many are, but fewer. So one can keep saying Hare Krishna, it's all very easy, but that's what the practice of the search is about. So, about oneness of all there is, and sometimes maybe even forgetting that this oneness is meant to be at the very essential aspect of the people or the substance. For example, a remark that I had quoted here from a very highly regarded sage in India, Sri Anrivan. I was fortunate to meet with him. He actually said to me as I was leaving, when you realize that God is the same as dog, you would know something real. It is true, at least according to the whole of the Indian tradition, and something in me acknowledges that if and when I can in fact come to that level of perception, I would know something true. It's quintessentially Indian expression, although I have never heard anybody else express it in those words. But what one then forgets, that is not strictly speaking true in the usual manifested world. If a mad dog was coming to bite my son, should I just assume that it is dog coming to bless him? Or do I undertake some action? I mention this because you would then see that in the whole of the Abrahamic tradition, the emphasis is on the uniqueness of everything, of everyone, which partly really therefore relates them more and more with the manifested universe. In fact, occasionally people say that they forget the remark of Christ that my kingdom is not of this world. They are engaged with this world, forgetting that there is something beyond this world. This is often taken as one of the criticism of the. And on the other hand, in the Indian version, so occupied with the other world, they forget to take care of this world. Everything has, this is actually a remark of Guruji, if every stick has two ends. Every great idea has its negative side. Particularly by the time it's manifested among 8 billion people, guaranteedly, out of those 8 billion, maybe 8 will try to understand this at the subtlest level, and the others will be understanding it all varieties of levels of that stick. This is why I repeatedly remind people, every Nazi called himself a Christian, read the same gospel as John of the Cross read. The source has some value, but the quality of the receiver is also very important. It's the same gospels. Whatever source, whatever is the quality of the gospels, that doesn't change. But the readers are different. This is really the reason when people are called to be searchers, and the fundamental requirement to be a serious searcher is to practice a radical transformation of one's whole being. To begin from where we are, almost guaranteedly, again, just to make quote a remark of this man I just quoted, Sri Anirvan, this is another of his remarks. The whole world is like a big bazaar in which everyone is trying to make their bargain at the top of their voice. This is his remark. It's easy to look at the others, approve or disapprove. A searcher looks at oneself. Fundamental requirement in any serious teaching is impartial, steady self-inquiry. We could call it self-look, self-study, self-observation, self-knowledge. Don't get stuck with one word or the other, but basically, how can I impartially and deeply look at what I am, what goes on in me? I often say, just look at your calendar for the day and your bank account. That will tell you where your occupation is. What is one spending one's time and energy on? So, repeated emphasis on this, but again, usual religious organizations are not interested in this. You don't see any emphasis on self-study in the whole of the canonical Bible. Don't take my word for it. You can go to Google and check the whole concordance. Put the word like self-knowledge or self-study or self-inquiry, put any of these words. If you can find a single entry, I will be surprised. But you read the remarks of any of the Jewish, Christian, Muslim sages, this is the repeated call. But usually they are either not being reported in the churches or they are sometimes non-canonical. Here is a remark. I have to remind him, you see. The kingdom of God is within you and outside you. If you would know God, you must know yourself. when you know yourself, you will be known, and you will realize that you are the son of the living Father. If you do not know yourself, you are in poverty. In fact, you are poverty. Very strong statement. It's Gospel of Thomas. Similarly, everywhere else, the call really is, even what is the purpose of self-study? If I actually see what is standing in my way, how can I practice to be rid of what stands in my way? Or to find, as I often say, one doesn't need to get rid of anything, but needs to find the appropriate place of everything. If you're again but don't dismiss what I'm saying. To be free of something requires to find what place it has in me. What does it serve? And then as I see it more and more clearly, as I have more than once said, awareness itself is the mechanism of transformation. That awareness would lead to some change, some transformation. In fact, there is no other mechanism of transformation in the spiritual search. Sometimes it is said that a great sage can bless you and you're transformed. Maybe. This is not part of my experience. So, very strong emphasis on self-study, but the purpose of that really is the transformation of my whole being. The call, again and again, several times I have quoted this, even the remark of Christ, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. This is in the Gospel of Matthew, canonical Gospel. In fact, in other Gospels, the same thing is said more strongly. Unless you die to yourself, unless you die to the world, you cannot be a follower of mine. So, the call really is to be free of what is usually occupying me, me. Again, as I have also tried to convey, that to be free of something doesn't mean to be against it, but to find its proper place. If you're against it, you'll never get rid of it. Take my word for it. Try it. But to be free of oneself is really the call. Again, gets expressed in varieties of ways. Yesterday, I quoted him for God who is full of himself. Fairly straightforward sentence. There's no room in him for God who is full of himself. So, the in oneself, because again the suggestion is that in fact God is searching us much more than we are searching God. We must have some concern for the world. This is why it is said, John 3rd chapter, God so loved the world that he gave his begotten Son. Why? Why did he send his begotten Son? Because he loved the world, wished to take care of it. And basically it is this form of sacrifice. That's a whole different area. I don't have time to go into this now here. But sacrifice is the part of all spiritual teaching. Rig Veda actually makes this remark, Yagya Bhuvanasya Nabhi. Sacrifice is the navel of the cosmos, around which everything turns, the whole order. Maybe I didn't want to go into the details of this, but I'll give you a simple example to test yourself. If any of you, for any length of time, have been in love, could the status of love be meant? Sacrifice undertaken. Try it. And since love is said to be God, without occasional sacrifice. So you can look at it at the usual level of whatever we call And without at least an occasional one's particular attachment to some kind of food or some kind of other activity. Anybody who has even remotely thought they have been in love, test this. So, therefore, this emphasis in the two teachings, or because, for example, in the Indian tradition, to stick with one's individuality uniquely is regarded as a mark of ignorance. Because the suggestion is that a sage's spirit enters into the cosmic spirit at death. You can never find an expression like this in the whole of the Abrahamic tradition, because even in the presence of God, Moses speaks to him as a man to a man. You can read this in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, if you're interested. Because this notion of individuality is very strong. Because in the Abrahamic tradition, individuality is the source of responsibility. So, if one ignores one side, then one says it's a mark of ignorance. If one ignores the other side, then one says they're irresponsible. Which is the reason I'm trying to invite you to realize that different traditions emphasize different things. Sometimes more severely, sometimes just mildly. And that how to make room for the, rather to me seemed like an obvious fact, that half the sages of the world didn't get the matter wrong. But they have different expressions. And then the expressions is what really occupies the usual people. They just keep repeating them. That's what gets said again and again in the temples and the churches and the synagogue. So those words get repeated, and they have a large impact on how the society runs. So, therefore, to have more than one expression or one way of saying something can also be freeing from not getting stuck to the expression. This is the thing I'm trying to point out. In a global culture, how can we allow other sages also to say something that might help us? Of course, if you're a missionary type, obviously the other guys are wrong. That's clear. They're saying some different things. That means they don't understand the truth. This might engage you to know in 1993, when they had a parliament of religions, world religion, Catholic Church refused to participate. How can there be any other religion? Check historically. No, but you see, this is one of the difficulties. Again, there are many other differences that I have spoken about. For example, in the Indian tradition, the source for freedom from me, ultimately is right knowledge or right understanding. The source of all the problems from their perspective is avidya, which means ignorance. But not just standard kind of whatever we mean by scientific or philosophical knowledge. It's the knowledge which changes the knower. And it has certain characteristics, such as that it is free of the time sequence. For example, Christ's remark, before Abraham was I am, would be completely acceptable idea from the Indian perspective, that true knowledge is free of time sequence. But in the Abrahamic tradition, the very next verse, again, this is chapter 8, John's Gospel, 58th verse. Next one is 59. They pick up stones to try to kill him, because it doesn't make any sense from their point of view. Raman Maharshi has said something very similar. Krishnamurti occasionally has implied this. He may not use precisely these words, but that something understood without the time sequence Nobody picks up stones to try to kill them in the Indian tradition. This is understood that it is a possibility for a real understanding by a sage. So similarly, there are really many other differences, but since my time is coming to an end here, my call to all of you is, by the way, before I complete that in the Abrahamic tradition, faith becomes the way to be freed or to be saved. In fact, for several decades, until relatively recently, faith was even used as a way of saying religion. In fact, there are even a famous book by some people called Faiths of Other Men, by which they mean religions, other religions. And so the word faith coming from the biblical tradition becomes the central perspective which can save you. And Christ is the savior. Nobody in India, none of the teachers are regarded saviors. They bring you some wisdom, some understanding, if you follow their practice or their call. So what is required is the right understanding or right knowledge. I use the word understanding because the word knowledge can also mean standard scientific knowledge. That's not what they're talking about. So there are many other differences that follow from all this. For example, the Abrahamic tradition, everything in it, every religion is centered around a particular historical figure or a historical event. That is not the case. There is no historical figure around which Hinduism is centered. That doesn't mean there are no historically important people, but they are not the founders of this. It is dealing with what is called Sanatan Dharma, eternal law. Any true Christian is a Hindu if they are actually following the eternal law. Which is why whenever they are asked to convert people, for example, Raman was asked, or Aurobindo, and the people always say, if you're coming from the Christian background, follow Christianity seriously, then you will come to the center. What they are trying to do is to bring you to the center of yourself, which from their perspective is identically the same.
That's right. And something I'd like you to elaborate on. I've been thinking about since last week this notion of the betrayer and the function of the betrayer when we talked last week about Judas. This morning I did read that gospel. And Mark continued and said that Kay also had said everyone needs a Judas. So I'm interested in that, and you touched on it a little today about that the tradition needs to be fulfilled in some way and then transcended. So I understand that it has something to do with that. But I wonder if you can relate it to the idea of Mara.
Idea of?
Mara, to the self-destructive tendency that inhibits transcendence. So you said last week, I don't remember where the quote was from, about get Mara behind me, be able to use it.
That's the remark of Christ. To Satan, get thee behind me.
Exactly. Satan. So what is I'm interested first in the notion of betrayer and the function of the betrayer, and then I'm interested in the relationship to Satan or to Mara.
Yeah. First of all, an etymological background here. The word tradiere, coming from Latin, has two meanings. One is to deliver, the other is to betray. And therefore, tradition and betrayal actually have the same etymological root, which may surprise people, but you can check this etymologically. And then what is important here is to realize that the entire purpose of the existence of Christ was sacrifice. Even the very expression that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, if you see, he's hardly giving him for having a nice bowl of cherries there. And Christ himself speaks that his baptism is sacrifice. This is not that he's just condemned to follow this. And then I have even more than once said that is actually at the very heart of all spiritual teaching. We need to understand that the word sacrifice, coming from the Latin root, means saker faker, to make sacred. That's the root of that word sacrifice. And so to make something sacred, first of all, requires that I'm not so attached to my usual self. Otherwise, the whole call is transformation, as I have repeatedly said. So I need to sacrifice my attachment to my usual self, which is more or less definitely driven by desires and fears of one kind or the other. So that is really the call. And again, I had also mentioned slightly in passing that in the real Jewish understanding, the fact that they are called chosen people, what are they chosen for? Not for any kind of grandeur in the world, but chosen for undertaking sacrifice, which is why I was quoting the great Rabbi Hillel, hardly a negligible rabbi. He actually said that God had made this offer to all the nations, but Jews were the only foolish ones to accept it. This is Rabbi Hillel's remark. And if you look at the Jewish history, throughout they have had sacrifice of one kind or the other. But this is so first of all, keeping that in mind, then when it comes to Christ ultimately now needs to undertake sacrifice, the worldly demonstration of that. Now here is another basic point to be made here. The general suggestion in several spiritual teachings, and I give you example from the Bhagavad Gita and also from the Abrahamic tradition, that major events first of all take place in the spirit world. Then appropriate drama is required to manifest them in the material world for others to see. So sacrifice of if aspect of God or a son of God has continually taken place throughout worldly history to maintain right order. You can see examples of this in the book of Revelation. This is not something I'm making up here. And here I quote directly, "The Son of God was slain from the foundations of the world." But now, periodically, it needs to be historically demonstrated. So now Christ, in order to historically be slain or crucified, now needs to have the appropriate drama. Drama may make it sound rather cheap. That's not what I'm trying to convey, but appropriate instrument or appropriate environment and appropriate setup. So I'm just trying to find some word to convey that. And therefore, he needs somebody, as it were, to, if you like, to betray him. Again, keeping in mind that betrayal and carrying on the tradition have the same etymological root. And Judas was highly regarded by Christ himself. First of all, at the Last Supper, if you look at any of the paintings, Leonardo da Vinci or any other painting, or whatever is mentioned in the Bible itself, at the Last Supper, Judas has the place of honor. Secondly, Christ there makes this remark because at one stage he wishes to touch the feet of the disciples and some of them are objecting to this. And in that kind of a context, he makes this remark that anybody that who I nourish will never perish. And Christ himself gives food to Judas to eat. So how could he perish if we take Christ seriously? So the suggestion therefore is, and I think I had mentioned the name of Peter Brook, a great theater director. I raised this matter with him on one occasion differently. And he said, in the making the film or in the theater, if they have to carry on some work which is usually regarded as terrible from people, like an evil person, it actually requires a more sophisticated actor to play that role. Therefore, Judas is called by Christ to play that role. And also to remind you, for 3 years before that, this is when anything in the gospel is said only about 3 years that these disciples are following him, from the age of 30 until his crucifixion at 33. For 3 years, Judas was the keeper of the treasury. So does it make any sense for him to betray him for 50 pence? He was the keeper of the treasury for 3 years. So I'm pointing these obvious facts out. They're all there in the Bible. It's not, none of this I have made up here. But then how do we look at them? That's the difference. My own impression is very strongly that Judas was the most highly regarded disciple by Christ himself. And then relatively recently, by which I mean about 20 odd years ago, another gospel has been found called Gospel of Judas. And there you see some of the remarks, etc. And even some of the other disciples actually say that Judas is more advanced than they are. That what Christ can teach him, he cannot teach the others yet because they're not prepared enough. So one needs to look at the whole thing really radically differently. But the trouble is, once this idea gets fixed in the church, Judas betrayed Christ for very few pences, actually. I don't remember the exact number given to this. On the other hand, one also needs to realize that if Christ didn't have, he saw Nathanael standing by a tree far away, and he could read what's in his mind. If Judas is hanging around him for 3 years and he can't read that Judas is a betrayer, why should we honor Christ? I mean, to me, it seems plainly obvious that if somebody is with him for 3 years, Christ would know what's in the heart of this character. He can even read somebody standing, as you read in the Bible, Nathanael is standing by a tree and Jesus says to him what is in his heart. So, in a way, we are speaking about somebody of an extraordinary wisdom and talent, having chosen this person whom he is honoring by giving him the place of honor, etc., etc. But then we need to understand that this action is required because Christ needs to be sacrificed. According to himself, this is his baptism. On the other hand, supposing, I often say this, if Christ had skipped town, everybody would be happy. All the Pharisees will be happy. They were not eager to crucify him. They wanted him to just leave. He undertakes the sacrifice quite intentionally and knowingly, because for him that is the will of God. You know, this is his last remark at the Garden of Gethsemane on the eve of his crucifixion. If it is possible, let this cup pass me by. Yet not my will, but thine be done. It's the will of God that he be sacrificed. He's following that. So, anybody else wishes to? Yeah. Yeah.
I want to ask a question and give an example first. It's a question for him. And my feeling is detachment need not mean indifference. My years in India studying Advaita Vedanta, detachment's a big part of the practice. But I saw more than one example of so-called spiritual practitioners who were so indifferent to human suffering right in front of them that it really affected me. It was such a lack of humanity. So we practice our spiritual practice and meditation, and you know, everything seems fine. And 2 days ago, I was watching the news on television about the Nashville shooting. And I just started crying. I couldn't help it, you know, the murder of children because someone's not happy with how things are. So I'm not sure how to frame my question, but I thought through years, you know, through 50 years of practice, I feel detachment is there, but that does not mean indifference, does it?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And this is, in fact, one of my major criticisms of the emphasis brought by Shankara. There is a specific expression in Sanskrit, if you don't mind, I mention this, which is very often quoted, quoting Shankara. Brahma Satya Jagat Mithya, which literally means that only Brahma is true and the whole manifested universe is an illusion or Maya. But from what follows then, sadly, for many people, as if it is irrelevant to take any interest in the manifested universe. So what you're saying is absolutely right, that this is one of the, from my perspective, one of the downsides of, although personally, if I read carefully what Shankara is saying or doing, he was actually, it's his followers mostly who seem to keep quoting this and get stuck on this one way or the other. And because he himself was even a poet, actually one of his poems ends with the words, "Oh mother, I wish to sit at your feet. I don't care for moksha, which is the highest aim in India, for liberation, or for anything else." So you see, in a way, he could be free of this notion. But his followers keep quoting this all the time, and they understand this to mean as if we can just forget about the manifested universe.
Of course, Shankara changed his philosophy toward the end. His early writings are very different from the later.
Yes, and to give a slightly more specific example, Shankara, sometimes I feel that he was more after winning rather than truth in any debate, etc. And he was, for example, one of his notion was that, see, there are 6 schools of philosophy in India. He was very much promoting the one called Vedanta. Yoga is another school of philosophy. So he was criticizing all the other schools, including yoga. And I think it was in 1979 or 1980, a big volume being produced on an Indian religion, and they wanted an article on yoga. And the editor asked me to write an article on yoga. And partly really coming from the scientific background, I was not particularly interested what anybody else had to say about it. I thought I'll just look at the text dealing with yoga, like the Yoga Sutra, etc. So I studied it very carefully, and I wrote an article on this without quoting anybody one way or the other. But the editor was a follower of Shankara. He was a Vedantist. He was absolutely appalled by my article because I tried to show there that the whole purpose of yoga is to bring Prakriti to truly serve Purusha, that the whole manifested universe is trying to serve God. Whereas Shankara had completely separated them, that Purusha and Prakriti have nothing to do with each other, separated from each other, which is the reason why Prakriti, manifested universe, is neglected. So the editor was rather surprised by my article. In fact, then he sent it to some other character in Calcutta. Later on, I asked him, if this other character is such a wise guy, why did you ask me to write the article? I was obviously the second choice because he says his English is not good. I was obviously not the first choice. I was the second choice. But this person who read the article, he said, what Ravindra is saying is true. He's quoting directly from Patanjali Yoga Sutra. And after that, this editor actually apologized to me, and he wrote generally that everybody can write their own commentary, don't have to follow what the traditional literature is saying. So I point this out. The trouble, I don't think, is so much with Shankara himself. It's the followers of his who keep quoting him and get stuck. It'll be the same thing. Christ may have said something, but it's the followers who can then keep quoting and doing some damn thing or the other in the name of it. You see, that's where the trouble comes. It's not that he's saying anything necessarily wrong. So, but it is usually in the name of Shankara that all this carries on. We can ignore the manifested world. Sometimes I feel that even if we have people from India, they can verify this or criticize this. You can go to somebody's home, they will take good care of it, but in the neighborhood, they don't give a damn of what takes place in the neighborhood. And then, on the one hand, the call again and again from Vedanta is that all is one, but they don't even want a lower caste person to even have their shadow in front of them. but everything is one. Now, you see what takes place.
So, from your point of view, what is the relationship between a spiritual practitioner of detachment and response to humanity?
No, I think the purpose of detachment is not detachment from the world, it's the detachment from my worldliness. One is, in fact, every searcher sooner or later finds that he carries the world with him, in him, and then begins to see that what is required is not getting rid of the world, but getting rid of the worldliness in him. And then one can also begin to see that to take care of the world may seem like a large project, but whatever, even taking care of the neighborhood, wherever one is actually an expression of literally compassion. You know, the very root of the word compassion is to suffer, to undertake other suffering. It comes from that, suffer with. That's the root, Latin root of this word, compassion, to suffer with. So you see, for example, the Buddha, he looks all around and undertakes compassion. He sees their suffering. And I think this is true. For example, this is the kind of impression one gets from whatever I have read or heard about Ramakrishna or about Vivekananda, that especially Vivekananda even more, he emphasized, he even said to his fellow monks in the Ramakrishna mission, that it is all very fine for you to sit in meditation, but please take care of the people in the neighborhood. It's more or less a direct remark of Vivekananda. So I think, but that compassion needs to arise from inside rather than it's a good idea to be compassionate. You know, this is always a bit of a difficulty. No, this is one of the reasons I actually often have much difficulty with Shankara personally. So I refer to him as that medieval philosopher.
Six schools of philosophy in India, and you mentioned two. What are the other four?
Oh, Sankhya is one. Let me see if I can even recall. Maybe you would know some of the others.
You mean in Hindu philosophy or all philosophies?
No, there are 6 schools of philosophy in the overall Hindu philosophy. I don't now especially remember their names, particularly, but there are...
Jnana, Bhakti, Jnana,
That's right. Jnana and Bhakti will be another one.
and karma, doing good works.
That's right. One more and more focusing on knowledge, another one focusing on more and more action, and yoga is different. And then Sankhya and yoga are actually fairly close to each other, although Sankhya doesn't have a notion of God or notion of Purusha in it. But in the Bhagavad Gita, the basic underlying philosophy is actually coming mostly from Sankhya, but it's a very subtle combination of Sankhya and yoga.
And one more question. Prakriti.
Say that again?
Prakriti.
Prakriti.
What is it?
Oh, Prakriti is usually translated as nature. But do keep in mind that nature is not all that we know about nature. There are many aspects of nature that are quite unknown to us. So the whole manifested universe can be called Prakriti. Yeah. But it is usually translated as nature. And Purusha can be called God. And very strong emphasis by Patanjali that the whole purpose of Prakriti is to serve Purusha. If you really wish to understand these two words slightly carefully, think of yourself as individualized Prakriti. Your body mind is individualized Prakriti. And this, whatever you mean by soul or spirit, is individualized Purusha. then does your Prakriti serve Purusha, or is it doing its own thing? So otherwise, Prakriti is endless. You or I, nobody will ever know everything about the manifested universe. But it is from a practical point of view, search yourself, and then you see what is this Prakriti actually doing with regard to the Purusha. So every spiritual teaching is much more assisted if we look at individualized spiritual element and an individualized material element, both in me. Then their relationship is really the whole purpose of the practice. Yes, Ryan.
Yeah. Hi, Professor. I was just wondering if you could maybe touch on the origin of life again, such as in the Bible, we have Adam and Eve and Genesis, and then you have the Big Bang Theory. I was just wondering what Eastern religion, philosophy teaches about that. I know you probably touched on it a little. If you could maybe just explain that, your thought on that.
Well, since you mentioned Big Bang Theory, one basic thing here I think I've actually mentioned this differently at different times. From the scientific perspective, the whole universe is manifested by evolution, by which we mean that it starts from the lowest level of consciousness, from completely dead matter, and then how one may not be able to explain all this, but that doesn't matter. It's not easy to explain from the other side either. But that somehow some small particles come together, making bigger particles, and then somehow life begins, and somehow consciousness comes. But the idea is that everything begins from the lowest level of consciousness. And this is the reason why ultimately describing anything, we have to describe this in terms of aspects of matter. Initially, by which I now mean when the modern science began, which was in the 16th, 17th century, I should make a general remark here. That is sometimes called the scientific revolution. That is actually not a revolution in science. That's actually a revolution in thought, which creates science. After that, because there is, of course, study of nature before that also, it will be silly to dismiss the whole Chinese understanding or the Indian understanding, or within the Western world, Greek understanding. A lot of understanding before that, but it changed the whole, it brought a whole revolution in thought. What would be considered real knowledge? Real knowledge will be that which manifests itself ultimately in terms of properties of matter. That is the basis of modern science. So therefore, it had to be expressed in terms of mass, length, and time. Anybody with any scientific background would know what I'm speaking about here. In the 19th century, charge was added to that because they realized that charge coming from the electromagnetic theories could not be described in terms of mass. And in the 20th century, largely coming from quantum mechanics, spin, this is another characteristic, was added. But still, in any case, the idea is that ultimate reality has to be described in terms of matter. This is completely contrary to every spiritual teaching. For them, the whole universe is not by evolution, it's by involution, starting from the highest level, coming to lower and lower levels of manifestation. Does that speak to your question? Okay. Anybody else? Anybody from the Zoom here? Yes, Valerie, please. Unmute yourself. People begin to speak.
Sorry. So you have mentioned that very few people have managed to reach the source of this journey that we're all on. And it's also been remarked that it's very hard, to be on this journey requires time and awareness and study and radical transformation of the whole being and steady self-inquiry. It's an it's seemingly a very arduous task in a way. But it also seems to me that some of the population of the world sort of has the luxury to embark on this journey, but that there are, I don't know how many people on this earth who are suffering from famine or drought. They're migrating, they're in a war zone, and that they simply don't have the means to embark on this journey, even if they wanted to. And that just seems sort of unfair to me. That I don't know. This is just something I've been thinking about.
But in a way, spiritual journey is like any other enterprise. If I have even a vague interest in becoming an artist, painter, or a sculptor, first of all, out of 8 billion people, how many people are wishing to become artists? And then how many have the facility or enough means to spend time and energy to become artists? And then how many of them will come to the level of Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo? But that doesn't mean that more people or some people can't have a wish to be an artist. They undertake what they can undertake. And some of them may become good artists enough, but some can get. Maybe I tell you an example from my own life. Many years ago, everything what I say is many decades ago in my case. I sometimes forget how old I am. I was taking some painting classes with people, 3 or 4 other friends, with a painting teacher. And I suddenly realized that rather than really paying attention to what the teacher is saying, I'm thinking of when this painting will hang in the National Art Gallery. So many things stand in our way, not only external possibilities or external means. Our own mind is occupied with success or failure of one kind or the other. I have a very clear memory of this in my own mind. Now, what I'm saying to you, not every artist or any other field, not every physicist is going to become like Newton or Einstein. Not every artist is going to become Leonardo da Vinci. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a search. But even there, not everybody out of 8 billion people is going to do one thing or the other. It is true what you're saying, that actually you probably didn't even emphasize the numbers. My own impression is that almost half the population in the world is really wholly occupied with survival. Getting enough food, place to stay, enough clean water, etc., etc. People in the USA and Canada don't realize that these are very wealthy countries here. You people have, Canada the same way. So we don't encounter this, except occasionally you meet homeless people or something like that. But in many countries, great deprivation, not enough good water to drink, not enough food to eat, or places to sleep properly. So therefore, a kind of a sadness about it is quite understandable. But what I'm saying is that in no way is any different from any other kind of enterprise, whether you're doing physics or whether you're doing painting or whether you're interested in spiritual search. Very few people are interested, and it is true that among them, extremely few could possibly come to the level of Christ or the Buddha. But this is equally true in every other enterprise. But that doesn't mean that you should give up. If it interests you, undertake the journey, and more gradually one would realize that journey itself is the interesting project. Whether I get to the destination or whether I become the level of the Buddha, it's a secondary matter. journey itself is nourishing.